So I'm going to be talking about cell communication, and this is the ability that cells have to really talk to each other. And when cells talk, what we really mean is that they are sensing something in their environment and then responding to them. And this is really important for organisms, whether it's a unicellular organism like yeast that wants to know how much food there is in the environment, or whether it's an organism more like ourselves that are multicellular and need to coordinate what the different cells are doing in the organism. So again, cell communication is really a two-step process. Cells need to be able to detect a signal out in the environment, and then part of that communication is then responding to that signal in the environment. So some examples of this, this is a unicellular example where we have a yeast cell. And again, like I mentioned, they need to know if there's food out in their environment out here. And if there is food, then they're going to respond to that food by making the things that they need to digest that food. So in this case, if there's glucose in the environment, then they want to have a protein to bring in glucose. And then they want the enzymes that they need to break down that glucose. This is an example from multicellular organism, and this is plants doing something that you've probably seen plants do, which is bend towards light. So in order to do this, there are cells in the plant near the tip that detect light, and then they send a signal down to the other parts of the plant down here, and this is where the bend actually occurs. So the cells up here detect light, they send a signal to these guys and let these cells know that they should bend towards that light. So again, this is coordination of many cells in a plant. You're familiar with this in your own body too, because in your brain you make a decision like, I want to take a step forward, and that signal has to get transported down your nervous system and make its way to, say, your foot to swing forward and take a step. So there's 5 types of signaling, and you really do just need to know these 5 types of signaling. And so they're called direct intercellular, contact-dependent, autocrine, paracrine, and endocrine. And these definitions are here in your chapter outline. And so I'll skip forward to the picture and talk about them there. So the first type of signaling is direct intercellular signaling. And direct intercellular signaling involves cells that actually live next door to each other. And so if I draw it over here a little bit, get my pen over here. And so in direct intercellular signaling, whoops, get it over here, you have 2 cells that live next door to each other, and because they live next door to each other, they can directly exchange materials. And you can see that in this image here. And so in order for that to occur, there has to be a gap between the cells through which that can pass. In contact-dependent signaling, this is cells that have to get close together, but they don't have to live next door to each other. So that's kind of the difference between these two. Have to live next door to each other. These guys just have to get in contact with each other. They don't have to live next door to each other. The reason why they have to get in contact with each other is because a receptor, which is the receiving part of the signal, so this is kind of like the antenna, and the signal on the other cell, so this is what's being received by the antenna, they have to physically touch each other. And once the receptor and the signal of the 2 cells touch, then a signaling event can occur. Autocrine signaling comes from this, or the significant part of this is the auto part, which means self. So this is when a cell, and this is the cell in the center here, this cell can actually, whoops, okay, so this cell in the center here is going to send out signals. So we'll see if I can get the pen to work here. So this cell in the center is going to send out the signal. And these cells nearby have receptors. So that's what I'm drawing here, these little cups. They have receptors that can receive that signal, But then what makes this autocrine signaling is that this cell also has receptors. So it can receive its own signal. So it receives a self signal, and that's where this term autocrine comes from. If I look at paracrine signaling, it's really similar. There's a cell in the center that's sending out signals to nearby cells. These nearby cells have receptors that can receive the signal. But the reason why it's not autocrine is that this cell does not have any of those receptors, so it is not self-signaling. It's paracrine, so other signaling, not self-signaling. In both autocrine and paracrine signaling, it's nearby cells. So notice that these cells that are receiving this signal have to be sort of nearby, but they don't have to actually touch the cell because the cell is sending out a signal. That brings us to the last one, endocrine signaling. And this is the type of signaling that you're probably the most familiar with. Endocrine signaling is long-distance signaling. So it's signaling that can come from one place very far away in the body. The signal gets released into the bloodstream, and then it gets distributed throughout the bloodstream, and somewhere very far away, a target cell can receive that signal. So this could be in the ovaries, let's say. This could be in the breasts, right? So the ovaries are releasing estrogen, which is a signal. The estrogen travels through the bloodstream, and then that estrogen reaches the breasts and will cause changes to breast cells. Other examples of endocrine signaling, one that has come up before is adrenaline. Adrenaline is released by endocrine cells, distributed through the bloodstream, travels to all the different cells in the body, and causes this particular response that we're familiar with of the increased heart rate, the increased breathing, dilation, etc., etc. So those are the 5 different ways that cells signal. So now we'll take a minute and just talk about what actually happens when that signal reaches the receptor. So talking a little more about that signaling molecule and that receptor. So remember I said earlier that the receptor is like the antenna that receives the signal. So the very first thing that happens is that the signaling molecule has to bind to that receptor. So remember in biology, when things bind to each other, that means shapes match. So you have your signal, you have your receptor, and they are going to match up with each other. They have matching shapes, okay? So once that happens, then something in the receptor changes. So again, like a theme we've seen before in biology, when one thing binds to another, you can get a shape change. So you have your receptor, you have your signal, and then something about the receptor is going to change. So I'm flipping my arm up here as the shape change that occurs, okay? And then that's going to pass the signal down until the last step, which is the response. Because remember, if there's going to be a communication, there has to actually be a response. And how a cell responds can really vary. It can make an enzyme be more active. It can slow down an enzyme. It can change a protein in the cell, like for example, make one of these structural proteins change so that the cell has a different shape, so maybe the cell can move. Or it can just change gene expression, so it can change the way that any protein is being made, so there's more or less of any different type of protein. So this depends entirely on the signal, and we're not going to talk very much about that. So this is this image from your textbook showing this process. So here's my receptor hanging out in the membrane. A signal is going to come in, and when that signal binds the receptor, and again, see that shape match, there's something that happens in the receptor. So here it was curled, here it's straight. So this is now an activated receptor. That initiates a cascade called signal transduction, where the message basically gets passed. It's like playing telephone. And then eventually that's going to lead to some sort of response like I was talking about. Either enzyme activity is going to change, structural protein is going to change so the cell looks different or is able to move, or the cell changes the way that it's making proteins to make more or less of a protein. And so that's cell signaling. So again, this is all we're going to cover from chapter 9.